So from the origin of life to the great oxidation event, episode 8. This is the final episode. Last episode, we talked about different forms of evidence and reasoning for what played out during the Archaea. We talked about fossils and molecular fossils, though those didn't work so well, but we got some exciting results with molecular phylogeny using isotopes. Now this episode, we'll start taking the inductive approach. And we'll start by with that microbial redox tower. So remember that bacteria can respire other things than oxygen. Oxygen is the best electron acceptor they have. It provides them with the most energy and the highest fitness. But there's no oxygen. There's bacteria that can use nitrate. If there's no nitrate anymore, there's bacteria that can use iron and manganese. That's gone or totally reduced. There's bacteria that can use sulfate, and finally CO2. So there's an order to that based on thermodynamics. After the origin of life, there was no oxygen, there was no nitrate, there was no sulfate. Everything was kind of reduced. So what do? You cannot do any of those things. So if there would be a source of organic matter, those might be meteorites, or it might be created by lightning in the atmosphere or volcanoes. You could do a little bit of fermentation, but there's not much energy in that, and life would never move forward because it would always be dependent on that source of organic molecules. So how can it move forward? Well, there's only one way it could, and that is it would take the energy from light and perform carbon fixation. So if you want to fix carbon, you have to reduce the carbon. So you need a source of electrons, so you have to oxidize something else. And that something else, oxidizing that something else, might then produce these other compounds that you could use for respiration. So let's look at the order of things. So the best source of electrons is hydrogen, H2. And hydrogen is one of those compounds that might come about by volcanism, hydrothermal vents. If you have hydrogen, it's so good you don't need any light to fix CO2. So you can make biomass from CO2 if you have a source of hydrogen. So that's one of those things that might have happened at the very beginning next to fermentation. And then we go to the thermodynamically impulsible reactions, which would only run if you can drive them with light energy. And the first one is hydrogen sulfide. You could use that as an electron donor. Hydrogen sulfide might also be available in the beginning, again coming from, for example, hydrothermal vents. So you would need one photon to drive that reaction, and you can get sulfate out of that. Okay. The other reaction that would run with one photon is using iron as electron donor. It's not as good as hydrogen sulfide, but likely there was a lot more of it. So after the hydrogen sulfide ran out, that's the time when organisms might evolve that use iron. And so they would oxidize the iron, which could lead to, for example, banded iron formation, even before the great oxidation event, and we know those exist. Then there's things that are even harder to oxidize. First one is manganese. Here you need more light energy, so 2 photons to perform those reactions, and use manganese as electron donor for photosynthesis, CO2 fixation. And finally, the most difficult one is using water. You need 2 photons. But the good news is water is very abundant, so you can always continue. And there's another thing about water, using water and producing oxygen, because the oxygen is poorly soluble. So once you start photosynthesizing this way, what happens is your oxygen bubbles out. Your organic matter, of course, would stay in place. So, but because the oxygen is removed from the site of action, it's harder to kind of reverse the action, right? If you photosynthesize with iron, you produce oxidized iron, and the oxidized iron stays there, and another organism that respires could kind of reverse the situation. That becomes harder with um, with um, oxygenic photosynthesis. That means that the amount of the oxygen in the atmosphere is proportional to the amount of carbon buried. And this was first laid out by Engelbert Broda, very creative theoretical biologist who thought very deeply about these processes in the 1970s. So what happened is the origin of life likely very early. So during the Archaean, two different photosystems evolve independently, and each of those enables these reactions of iron and hydrogen sulfide. Okay, so different bacteria obtain a version of either photosystem. Then the magic happens, and the cyanobacterium combines both photosystems and evolves the manganese cluster for oxygen production. And so that is shown here. Prochlorococcus. What does this system look like? So we have two photosystems, photosystem 2 on your right, photosystem 1 on your left. The oxygen evolving complex, which consists of manganese, is part of that photosystem 2. It has a large antenna complex with proteins that capture more light and kind of fluoresce it back to the photosystem. So this manganese cluster is very interesting because it looks like once photosynthesis was able to use manganese, it directly went straight on to oxygen. So is evolution of photosynthesis enough to oxidize the atmosphere? And the answer is no. It's not enough by itself. We need another factor. We need another process, and that's called the biological carbon pump. And it's a combination of two physical processes, sinking and solubility. So what happens is you have photosynthesis, and as I explained, the oxygen is poorly soluble. You get oxygen bubbles, the oxygen escapes to the atmosphere. At the same time, the organic matter sinks, and the organic matter accumulates on the floor, on the ocean floor, and as the ocean floor moves from a divergent plate boundary to a convergent boundary, that sediment accumulates, and that can be up to a kilometer of sediment. So the amount of oxygen in the atmosphere is equivalent to the amount of biomass that sinks. If nothing would sink and all the oxygen would be consumed by respiring organisms like Pelagibacter, there would be no oxygen accumulation in the atmosphere. So the better the sinking happens, the more oxygen you build up. And I think that's where, for example, the eukaryotes come in, because they can consume those bacteria, those cyanobacteria. They're bigger organisms. They sink faster, especially after they become multicellular. That biological carbon pump speeds up, and you get more and more oxygen in the atmosphere. Right? So that's an important factor. So you see that biological carbon pump in this carbon cycle picture with a small arrow that goes into the ocean floor surface sediments. Right, that is the amount of extra oxygen that gets added to the atmosphere. Now, if you want to build a lot of biomass, which apparently happened after the Great Oxidation event, you need a lot of nitrogen because all those cells have to make protein. Now, the nitrogen in the biosphere quickly runs out, and we need nitrogen fixation to compensate that by taking nitrogen from the air. So nitrogen fixation is must have evolved before or after the Great Oxidation event. And one of the interesting things is that this nitrogen fixation, these nitrogenase, the way the enzyme is called, depends on certain metals like molybdenum. And those metals might not always have been available. And people have speculated that after the Great Oxidation event, this might have led to a crisis in nitrogen fixation because it took away the molybdenum. And the way that works is as follows. So, we've got an idea now on what happened during the Archaea and what led up to the Great Oxidation event. Now let's look at the consequences. So we still had quite a weak sun at the time. So the Earth needed a much stronger greenhouse to keep its temperature compatible with life. And that greenhouse was provided with methane, ethane, hydrogen, carbon dioxide, a lot of these gases in the atmosphere. Of course, methane is a very strong greenhouse gas. Now, when the oxygen was added to the atmosphere, the methane and the ethane and the hydrogen disappeared. Chemically, biologically, the greenhouse was compromised, and we got a snowball Earth effect. That's one of the consequences. Banded iron formations are another consequence because the oxygen would the oxygen would oxidize, reduce minerals, leading to banded iron. As mentioned before, some of the banded iron happened before the Great Oxidation event, for example, because of iron-dependent photosynthesis. Now, the weathering of pyrite minerals was greatly sped up by this oxygen, and this led to a discharge of more sulfate into the oceans. And the oceans, presumably during the Archean, were ferruginous in nature, which meant that they were at a redox potential that enabled iron oxidation, iron reduction, lots of iron around, and no oxygen yet. So even the solubility of iron was higher. But then all that sulfate came in, and you got a lot of sulfate reduction, precipitation of the iron, accumulation of hydrogen sulfide in the ocean after the Great Oxidation event. Paradoxically, the ocean became more reduced, at least in some areas and at some times. So you get hydrogen sulfide, and the hydrogen sulfide then must have removed the molybdenum, which you need for nitrogen fixation. So you get a crisis, biological carbon pump stalls, and this might explain why the oxygen stayed so low for such a extensive amount of time before we only saw increases much later. So that is induction. So induction from the microbial redox tower indicates life likely progressed stepwise, producing ever more oxidized molecules. And this progression must have been performed by phototrophs. Evolution of iron-dependent phototrophs could have led to occurrence of banded iron formations. Ultimately, a fermentative cyanobacterium, or ancestor of cyanobacteria, integrated two photosystems and became the only surviving oxygenic phototroph. We know of no other phototroph that ever evolved that can produce oxygen. The rate of biological carbon pump determines the rate of O2 accumulation in the atmosphere. Active nitrogen fixation is also necessary to maintain a large O2 flux to the atmosphere. Nitrogen fixation requires molybdenum, and bioavailability of molybdenum is low in the presence of sulfide. So oxygenation of the atmosphere eliminated greenhouse gases, global catastrophe, major climate change, sparking the first snowball Earth event around 2.2 billion years ago. And it also increased weathering, for example, of pyrite minerals, which may have led to the sulfide-rich ocean and stalling of nitrogen fixation. And it would have sped up plate tectonics. Amazing. All right, that concludes our final session. Thank you for staying with me, and I look forward to discussing this in class.